sustainability program and policy advocacy stream. We are living through the unimaginable once again. After 2 years of the pandemic, a war broke out on the European continent, with the Russian Federation invading Ukraine, and with what we thought was the bleakest scenario, the tail option, actually materializing. The situation has escalated quite rampantly in the course of this week and the last week. The Western allies have reacted by standing with Ukraine on all fronts, rolling out assistance, as well as unleashing several tranches of economic, financial, and other sanctions against Russian persons, companies, and other individual targets over the past week and a half, from sanctions of a symbolic character and little practical significance early on to pulling the heavy-duty ones, such as cutting off selected Russian entities off of SWIFT and targeting the Russian central bank and its foreign exchange reserves. The impact of these measures was almost instant in Russia, with more effects expected in the upcoming weeks and months to come. Today, we will focus on such economic and social repercussions and impacts of the Russian aggression in Ukraine and the sanctions that were issued in response by the West rapidly and in a very synchronized manner, I have to say, on both Russia and the European economy. I'd like to dive straight into it. We have a lot on our plate and a diverse expert panel consisting of, and I will now introduce our estimated speakers. We have Ms. Annika Eriksgaard, the director at the European Commission of DG ECFIN-D, of International Economic and Financial Relations, Global Governance, and also a head of unit of D2, covering neighborhood countries and the macro financial assistance. So very, very pertinent agenda Ms. Annika has. Then we have Mr. Luca Felice Mezzomo, the head of macroeconomic analysis at the research department of Intesa San Paolo. And last but not least, we have Mr. Vladimir Milov, the Russian opposition politician and a former deputy energy minister. Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for being here with us today during these turbulent and busy times. My name is Sonia Muzikarova. I'm the policy director and the chief economist at Globsec, and I will be happily leading today's session. A few housekeeping notes. The registered participants will be able to ask questions via the Zoom Q&A option and or via chat all throughout the session. But also as a second option for interactive conversation. At the end of the session, there will be a dedicated time. We're hoping for at least 10 minutes for a Q&A. So the way to ask a question for registered participants, please raise your hand, unmute, and turn on your video. And my colleague from production will add you to the stream so you can ask your question in person. So let us dive straight into it. And I'd like to start with where we stand today, starting with Luca. Ever since Russia seized Crimea in 2014, Western sanctions have failed to bite or act as a credible deterrent against Russian aggression. Many think so, some don't. But the new measures targeting Russia's financial system announced by some of the G7 partners on February 26th could act as a game changer, could change this. So Luca, if you could give us a quick recount of the economic sanctions that were issued, what they're hoping to achieve, and what they are targeting, and why, and what are the initial impacts on the Russian economy of these sanctions versus maybe some longer term expected impacts. Luca, please, and then maybe I will also ask Vladimir to elaborate on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. I think the reaction of the EU, of the US, and the UK this time has been much more forceful than before. And without entering into many details, I would rank the sanctions into three main categories. One is financial. So there were measures aiming at reducing the access of Russia to capital markets in Europe and in the US, and to global payment systems. You mentioned the measures taking some Russian banks off of the SWIFT network, but there are also others not involved in access to the SWIFT network, much reducing the access of banks to the global payment system and to capital markets in the EU and in the US. And another very relevant measure decided was the decision to take access to a significant share of currency reserves off the range of possibilities of the Russian central bank. That was very important, and we saw immediate consequences on the external value of the Russian ruble and on also financial stability domestically, because we saw over the weekend an increase in liquidity outflow within the banking system. So I think these measures have been very effective in the short term. Second type of measures I would mention those against the export of some technology to Russia in specific areas. Something has been tried already with other countries subject to sanctions in the past. For instance, oil refining capabilities, keeping for oil refining, microelectronics. So in some areas where the West has some edge to exploit. Of course, there's a risk that supplies from Europe or the US will be replaced by supplies coming from China, for instance. So in some areas, this is a possibility we should take into account. But past experience shows that this offsetting by China isn't totally effective. So I do expect some negative implications for technical capabilities in those areas in any case. Third, the targeting of the wealth of the ruling elite outside Russia. I mean, in terms of implication in general for the economy, it's not very significant, but it could add to the general effort. Regarding the impact, you probably mentioned already some of the negative implications in the short term. We do expect now these measures to push Russia into a recession in the short term because of a combination of devaluation of the ruble, hike in interest rates, and also the disruption of global value chains. We should not forget that, because now we are seeing many companies, even if they are not forbidden from dealing with Russia, refraining from sending ships and goods. So there will be disruption in the short term to global value chains with a negative impact on the local industry. So the impact will be very severe in my view. In the medium term, probably will be some recovery. But as usual, sanctions, I mean, we should be realistic. Sanction will not stop the invasion of Ukraine. That's for sure. But they will be able to reduce the growth in the medium and long term. And so in so doing, will widen the gap, which was already building between Russia on one hand, China on the other hand, and the US also. And so in relative terms, it will be more difficult for Russia to embark on an imperialistic agenda. So the military effort will become more difficult to sustain in the longer run. And this is probably the main reasons why we now have these sanctions. So it's more for the long-term effects. No one is really expecting these sanctions to stop the war in Ukraine, of course.
Thank you very much, Luca, for this nice intro on the economic sanctions and their impact. I would maybe ask Vladimir to elaborate on that and maybe let us build a little bit of a baseline here on the energy front. What is the EU energy security dimension's role in all of this? If you could give us a scoop with such a heavy reliance on Russia. The worry was that Europe would be abruptly cut off Russian gas, and instead yesterday the news broke out that the inflows have actually doubled. What is going on in here? What is the dynamic and the thinking behind this?
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I'll come back to the energy dimension in a second, but I wanted to continue on the overall broad effects of imposed sanctions. They are huge. Russian economy have never experienced anything like that. There are several dimensions. First, the actual scope of the sanctions is much bigger than what is being announced by the governments and being discussed by the media. Because what we see is many international players, companies are preemptively cutting off relations with any Russian counterparts, not even those who are under sanctions, even in some sectors which are well beyond the scope of the sanctions, but just in case. Because everything Russian is becoming toxic, and many businesses are doing that simply because of solidarity with Ukraine. So I think when we are assessing the overall impact of sanctions, we should go much beyond what is being announced and analyze the real market situation. Like, for instance, taking a glimpse of energy markets for a while, you see that there's been a great increase in spread, negative spread between Russian Urals exported oil blend with Brent, simply because of difficulties, because oil is not just simply sold. There's a complicated schemes usually used with banks, pre-financing and all that stuff. So many participants of the chain are actually refusing to work with Russian crude suppliers, and this causes a lot of problems and potentially reduced export revenue. We see a lot of announcements by international logistic companies handling container traffic, which announced that they would stop operations aimed at Russia. We also see, for instance, announcements by Chinese companies that they would seize transshipments of their goods through Russian territory and try to get rid of Russian transit, at least for a while. So there will be a disruption here as well. Now, I have to say, to make the long story short, every single Russian supplier of investment consumer goods, every single Russian manufacturer has some relations with international suppliers of components, raw materials, technology, and so on. For instance, in the Russian agricultural sector, harvesting is excessively dependent on seeds imports and all that stuff. So we're a very globally integrated economy. And we cannot even evaluate the overall impact, disruptive impact that sanctions will have across different sectors. What I hear from the Russian business community, that is going to be huge. That most manufacturers or suppliers of imported goods will have to stop operations sometime soon if there will be no major government support provided. However, there's this other front opening. You obviously understand that Putin expected some sort of economic backlash from the West when he invaded Ukraine. So he had accumulated record-breaking financial reserves, central bank reserves, which include the National Wealth Fund, the government-controlled part of financial reserves, which is altogether included in the central bank rainy day fund. However, most of this is now blocked because of the sanctions against Russian central bank. And only the limited portion, which is essentially gold reserves and reserves kept in renminbi, Chinese currency, are available. But they're absolutely useless in terms of maintaining the calm on Russian currency market. They cannot be used to support the ruble. Most of the reserves, which are normally used by the central bank to support the ruble, are effectively blocked by the G7 countries. Now, depreciation of ruble has drastic effects on the Russian economy because it destroys the purchasing power of Russians because of still significant dependence on imports in consumer industries. If not direct import of consumer goods, then Russian manufactured consumer goods are heavily dependent on imports of raw materials and components. So we saw in the previous 8 years that depreciation of ruble has destructive effect on consumer purchasing power. So here you see attacks on the Russian economy on many fronts. This is something unseen since I probably would say the late 1980s, when the Soviet economy began to collapse. Nothing of that sort has been seen ever since. We do not know. I would advise against rushing to evaluate the impact in figures, because there are so many very important indirect effects. We got to wait like 2, 3, 4 weeks maybe to see how the entrepreneurial communities are reacting to these disruptive effects. I'm afraid we got to see many closures and very, very strong negative effects on performance of the enterprises. Now, on the energy sector, I think my guess is that some forms of energy embargo of Russia is being considered as potential next wave of Western sanctions if Putin does not stop after all that was done. When people speak about oil and gas embargo, they usually say that, well, that's difficult to do because Europe in particular and the West in general and international markets are so dependent on Russian oil and gas. Now, that is true. However, the situation is pretty diverse in this regard. For instance, if we consider Russian supplies of crude oil, yes, it will be very disruptive. Russia is a huge player, like 10% of the market, and it will be a huge disruption for the global oil market if Russian oil supplies would have stopped. Not with petroleum products. Petroleum products are much more vulnerable. And this is what I know that some Western governments are considering taking action against the export of refined products in the first place, as opposed to crude. That will have a limited effect, but pretty disruptive in terms of cash flows into the Russian Federation. With natural gas, similar stuff. For instance, yes, Europe is pretty dependent on energy supplies from Gazprom. And I think you asked the question why the flows are increasing despite all that. I think this is maybe, to me, it looks like a little bit of a last resort pitch because companies understand that some sort of limitations on imports of gas from Russia may be introduced. So they rush to buy it now and fill the storage capacity, which is pretty exhausted after the winter season, knowing that essentially the couple of weeks' time, it might be too late. And I think I see that many policymakers consider that because the winter season have ended, yes, storages are empty, but we're out of the woods in terms of spring coming and less demand for natural gas. So maybe this is time for a stricter action. It will not have as hard impact on the European market as if sanctions were introduced in winter. And also LNG, for instance. Yeah, Europe imports some of the Russian LNG, but much of it goes to Asia. Primarily the Chinese market. The sanctions against Russian LNG, for instance, would be one of the forms of diverse forms of energy embargo, which will not hurt European markets so much, but will still have a big disruptive effect for inflow of cash into Russia. So there are plenty of options. I'd say with the military situation escalating, we can expect new waves of measures by the Western governments, including some in the energy sector portfolio, which might be extremely disruptive as well.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. I would like to switch gears slightly a little bit with you, Annika. You are responsible for macro-financial assistance MFA operation as a part of the EU's wider engagement with neighboring countries. To maybe bring our viewers up to speed, the MFA is intended as an exceptional EU crisis response instrument available to the EU neighborhood countries experiencing severe balance of payments problems due to an emergency. And the objective is to restore a sustainable external financing situation. So that was a little economic window of what this is trying to achieve. Annika, if you could maybe tell us a little bit about how you have been assisting Ukraine in this situation, and also if you have any other reaction to what has been already said by other panelists, please. The floor is yours.
No, thank you very much, Sona. Maybe just to pick up where Vladimir ended in terms of sanctions on Russia, I do think that the degree of unity and the swiftness of sanctions being put in place has taken Russia a bit by surprise. I'm absolutely convinced that Putin was expecting some kind of reaction, absolutely, but I would be surprised if he had expected, for example, the freeze central bank assets. So seeing how Russia has insulated itself since the invasion of Crimea in 2014 and 15, with the reserves that you rightly referred to, that calculation was sort of building on the assumption that you have access to those reserves. Now, a substantial part of them are not or no longer available to support Russia and the impact the sanctions and the war will have on their capacity to finance themselves. So the degree of recession, I absolutely agree, no one knows. At this stage, we do not know, but that there will be a recession, I think we can be absolutely sure of it in terms of the impact we are seeing right now. But on what we do with Ukraine. So indeed, thank you for the nice nutshell version of what macro financial assistance are. So you can think about it a little bit like a program that comes alongside an IMF program for countries in the EU's immediate neighborhood. And they are meant to, on the one hand, provide favorable financing, and on the other hand, also foster policy reforms. So that is to allow for a less disruptive correction of a crisis, and foster greater resilience, improved structural governance of the country, and depending on the country, policy reform conditions enter into the area of, in the case of Ukraine, typically looking at governance and rule of law, looking at corruption, but also business environment. So that there have been, since 2015, I think we have had 5 rounds of macro financial assistance programs with Ukraine, always alongside an IMF program, and it's set up in a way that we then contribute to the outstanding financing gaps. And they totally amount to 5 billion euros. This is a sizable amount of funds seen from our perspective. I think Ukraine has by themselves picked up almost 70% of what has been done in MFA over these last 6-7 years, which to one extent should also reflect the closeness of the EU with Ukraine and our wish to really stand by our partners at a very challenging time, a time that all of a sudden has changed. So I just want to recall the point also, as difficult as it is, that this is day number 8 of a war in Europe. And somehow this changes, I think, the way we look at the global order right now. I think it changes the way we look at how we are working together, etc. So this new proposal for an MFA that we are currently putting in place, which was adopted and published in the official journal at the beginning of this week, of 1.2 billion euros, would then be program number 6. And it obviously comes at an extremely challenging time. We will then, as soon as it is signed and then becomes legally enacted, and this will be signed today, but even just signing, how do you do that at this point in time? How can you ensure that a document is transmitted from Brussels to Kiev? Normally you do this on beautiful originals. Now we are doing this, sending it via mail. We find ourselves doing a lot of things we never thought we would. We see policy reactions in a lot of areas we never thought we would. This support should be there to really help in making an extremely disruptive situation, and disruptive is not strong enough a word, somewhat easier to manage. We have conditions for the second tranche in place, as is always the case for an MFA, but we have done them in a very limited number of policy areas, and they are rather few to take into account the situation, the feasibility of this being done or not. So we have this as a very strong expression of our wish to support Ukraine financially in this point in time. But it comes alongside a lot of other measures that the EU is undertaking to support Ukraine. So I would just want to make that point as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annika. And I would like to move and continue towards some scenario building and this forward-looking element of our discussion to perhaps give our audiences some flavor of what may lie ahead. But before I do so, I would like to remind our participants who are registered to think of questions and use the Q&A function on Zoom to send in the questions. Okay, Luca, I would like to revert to you. So, I mean, we have sketched out some potential sanctions. Vladimir has mentioned that probably this would have to do with some sort of energy embargo that may be under considerations. In your view, are there any other sanctions that can come down the line? And as a spin-off of that, what do we expect will most likely happen to the European recovery, GDP growth figures, nominal development and inflation? What are your baseline expectations for these macroeconomic variables? And also, how could this affect the ECB's monetary policy normalization path in your view? Luca, please.
Okay, let's start with sanctions and possible developments. I agree that the energy sector could be targeted in the future. It's very difficult. We'll need to do this very carefully because, of course, the impact on the European economy can be very, very tough, very hard if we are not well prepared in replacing what we miss in terms of energy supplies. Seasonality is a relevant factor from this point of view. Another possibility is in a further extension of sanctions against Russian banks. We are in a transition period, so sanctions did not close all the channels to make payments to and from Russia because there were already contracts underway. So we are in a transition, but the signal was sent. So I wouldn't exclude the sanctions to be extended to further Russian banks. So to close the connections, the links, the payment links even more in the future. Regarding the impact, the scenario uncertainty was mentioned over and over in the first part of this webinar. So it's difficult even to assess the impact of this crisis on the euro area economy. We are running a number of simulations of scenarios involving more prolonged or shorter shocks, involving a rationing of the supplies of natural gas. So many scenarios in order to assess the potential impact on the euro area economy of the crisis. Well, all analysis pointed to a very significant negative impact on GDP growth and a very significant positive impact on inflation. First channel of impact is the reduction in trade flows between the EU and Russia. For the sanctions, for the devaluation of the ruble, the recession in Russia. So many channels that will lead to this decline in trade flows. Last but not least, the disruption to supply chains, mentioned again even by Mr. Milov. So I think at this time the negative impact on trade flows will be much more relevant than after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Currently, we estimate the impact on the euro area economy in about 0.2 of a percentage point negative, but it could be an underestimation if the worst case scenario in terms of declining trade flows materializes. The most significant negative impact will come through the energy channel. We are already seeing that because of the skyrocketing of gas and oil prices even before the war started, and more that will come in recent days. Prices have risen even more. Now, through this channel, we'll take a hit through the trade balance because we are importing most of the primary energy. So the trade balance of the EU and of the euro area will deteriorate in a significant way. Domestically, the counterpart of this deterioration in trade balance will be a decrease in the real disposable income of households, which is already taking place because wages are not compensating, offsetting this increase in inflation. And let me add a deterioration in the profitability of the business sector in the euro area. Yes, some companies will benefit, those intermediating this flow of energy and producing electricity will probably benefit, but most of the business sector will suffer a decline in profitability, with negative effects on investments as well. So in general, we currently estimate the negative impact on the euro area economy in about 0.8% in 2022. So we currently expect GDP growth in the range of 3% rather than 3.8%, to be more precise. And about the same in next year if the shock is persistent. So it depends on what kind of scenario we have. So if there is a persistent shock of energy prices, then 2023 will hit too. Instead, if there is an improvement and prices go down, 2023 might show some a narrower gap compared to the scenarios without the crisis. But in any case, I would expect a slowdown in GDP growth even next year. Implications for monetary policy. Well, the ECB was announced in February potentially an acceleration in the path of the withdrawal of monetary stimulus. We were preparing to do so at their March the 10th meeting. Now everything is up in the air. Many members of the executive board and national central bank governors have told us that they do expect a significant negative shock on growth, a positive shock on inflation, but since this is a major negative supply side shock, the implication of monetary policy is that you wait and see, because it would be foolish to react to an increase in imported inflation by monetary tightening. So the ECB will probably stay put in March. They might reduce the scope of their forward guidance because there is so much uncertainty that it's difficult to provide guidance on monetary policy. And I guess that they might decide, for instance, to ditch the step-by-step decline in net asset purchase they announced in December 2021 to move to a more flexible approach. Potentially, they could announce a cumulative target for net asset purchases for under the APP for Q3, not monthly targets, in order to be more flexible in managing the program depending on how the scenario develops. And as for rate hikes, we have already seen markets basically giving up their expectations of a rate hike before the end of the year. They were pricing in 2 rate hikes just 3 weeks ago. Now they are down to 1, but not with 100% probability. I think this is the right approach because in this situation it's difficult to bet on when rates will rise. Certainly, the medium-term inflation outlook has changed. So I do believe the ECB, as soon as possible, will restart this process of withdrawing monetary stimulus. But it's not the right time to do so. This is the time to boost confidence, to provide support, and prepare for worst-case scenarios in case they materialize.
Thank you very much, Luca. And perhaps I would switch gears to Vladimir again and ask a similar question. I mean, we discussed inflation. It's hard to discuss that with what's going on with energy prices, with energy security. What are your leading scenarios for EU energy security, perhaps, I don't know, assuming that this energy embargo that you have mentioned at the beginning of the webinar will somehow materialize in the upcoming weeks? How can this likely unfold, and what are the options for Europe and for Russia, in your view, on the energy front?
Thank you. And I would say there are 2 components in this question. First is obviously related to potential energy embargo or any other disruptions related to the ongoing war. The other thing, even besides the potential escalation of tensions between Russia and the West, is the energy market in itself. And one of the important components is the deliberate market manipulation by Gazprom, which we saw last fall and which had greatly contributed to European gas price hikes. And obviously that contributes to further inflation and so on. This might become a persistent situation, even regardless of how the embargo develops, because what Gazprom is doing is essentially they're announcing that they're sticking to only a minimum contractual commitments, And due to EU market liberalization policy, the share of solid contractual commitments have been reducing over the years, giving way to increased share of spot supplies. So what Gazprom did last year, it had refused to supply additional volumes to the spot market, and only has been sticking to a relatively minimum contractual commitments, which are at historic lows, the solid commitments under long-term contracts. This is how it had actually reduced physical gas supplies to the European market. And this had greatly contributed to deficit of gas in underground storages and to price hiking. Now, this can become a prolonged effect. We see European gas price surging again, not least because of the expectations of potential undersupply from Russia from one reason to another. So even without next harsh measures by the European governments against Russian gas, we can see that European markets might feel the tensions and energy prices might rise the same way they did past year. So I have been actually issuing a publication about the mechanics of how Gazprom manipulated the European market at the Wilfred Martin Center for European Studies. So feel free to see it on the website in more detail. But in terms of further escalation, I think it's pretty clear that in one way or another, there will be certain difficulties of receiving more volumes of gas from Russia, which will obviously translate into price. And in terms of oil as well, one way or another, embargo or not, we will see many effects of ongoing tensions also translating into price. Just like I said, the banks are experiencing problems with Russian counterparts, which reduces demand for Russian Urals crude, which would indeed push up other blends of crude oil, like we see Brent is well above 100 and so on. So all these crises, one way or another, embargo or not, will have a profound effect on prices and on inflation, which means that I think we can assume different scenarios from now on, but it's pretty clear that while we're still waiting for the big green European energy transition, the good old dependence on oil and gas supplies from Russia and other traditional suppliers will clearly have a significant effect on inflation, regardless of the war scenarios.
Okay, thank you very much, Vladimir, for this. And there will be. I also want to talk about upsides in the last kind of rounds that we have ahead of ourselves, because the pandemic has served as a catalyst for many potentially good things as well. So we'll get to that. But before we do, I would like to ask Annika to maybe provide her perspective looking forward with respect to macrofinancial assistance operations. What are you planning for the future? What assumptions and scenarios are you relying on or operating with respect to Ukraine in particular, and also given what we have heard from the colleagues today?
Thank you. Maybe just 2 points first on the really useful points both from Luka and Vladimir. So just to make the point very clear, we will be affected in Europe. There's no discussion about that. Within the EU, the impact will differ across countries, but the recovery is not going to be derailed. We talk about a relatively firm recovery coming out of a pandemic that will be less firm than we thought a bit earlier, but we are not talking about a recession, just so that it's very, very clear in terms of our messaging here. We do talk about a recession, and we do expect a recession in Russia now, so that the relative cost of this becomes clear to everybody. I do think equally that activity will be dampened, inflation will be higher. That is not only true now here if we talk about Russia and the EU, and obviously Ukraine being the most affected here, but there are also other countries that will have and will feel this quite clearly. So if you look at, for example, dependency on food stuff coming out of Ukraine, this may not necessarily now come. What will that make for food price inflation in countries like Lebanon, in Egypt, in Turkey? So I think we also need to look at this with a little bit broader angle and see what could happen. The same is true for Moldova, one of the bordering countries that is now also directly affected, just like Poland, just like Romania, etc., of influx of refugees, etc. Moldova is a very small country and is going through its own crisis and its own challenges. So looking ahead, when it comes to macrofinancial assistance, we are preparing in parallel to the new emergency MFA for Ukraine. We are already preparing a regular MFA for Moldova, recognizing and leveraging change in the political setup in that country, where we now have a president, a government, and a parliament that are all pro-reform. Wonderful, but there is quite a lot of challenges, and was quite a lot of challenges already before this, where now this obviously adds to it. So I would expect that we may need to do more to Moldova. We have MFA operations also to other countries ongoing. So just to recall, in response to the COVID crisis and how that affected, the EU proposed MFAs to 10 of its neighboring countries just to help with that adjustment. Most have been successfully completed last year. There are still 2 ongoing. One is to Bosnia and Herzegovina, another one is to Tunisia. I would expect that we may see a demand for more MFAs in the neighborhood, depending on their exposure to Russia, to Ukraine, or just how interconnected we are globally. On Ukraine, there will be massive reconstruction needs. Once somehow the situation stabilizes, there will be needs that we certainly didn't envisage before. So just to recall, Ukraine made a request for a new regular macrofinancial assistance at the end of last year for 2.5 billion euros. That at the time was quite a lot related to the situation in November last year, and in relatively near term, they also turned to the IMF and said we would envisage that when the current regular program, which is a standby arrangement, comes to an end in June, we would enter into a new type of fully fledged program with them of about 5 billion. So that was at the time, so late last year, the needs they saw they would not be able to finance themselves in order to go through and sort of further foster and moving towards graduation. That was clearly what was in our minds collectively, roughly the ballpark. Now, we will have a situation with the country where there will be a need to rebuild infrastructure, where there will be a need to rebuild a lot of capital, but also of human skills, and it's impossible to today estimate what that will be, how far-reaching that will be. I would expect the EU will be part of that, but it will need to be done very closely with international partners, with the World Bank, with the IMF. And it's today very difficult to see when and how we will be in a sufficiently stable situation to have regular programs going on. What we have right now, the emergency setup, might need to be topped up, or might need to be somehow followed by a new emergency one. I think it's very clear, and I hope that that has been also very well heard by our partners in Ukraine, but also elsewhere, is that we will stand by Ukraine. And in this, as long as there is a legitimate, democratically elected government in Ukraine, this is available. I make this point not just as a political point, but the macrofinancial assistance has 2 preconditions. One is a dispersing IMF program, and the other one is that the political preconditions are fulfilled, which implies that the partner country is respecting democratic mechanisms, is respecting the rule of law and human rights. So that is a requirement for us to be able to act and engage. So I find it difficult to speculate in terms of how much and by when, but I see absolutely a sustained engagement, and that engagement will need to be multiplied from its international partners in order to be able to respond to and help Ukraine to build back. It's also an opportunity. Maybe this is the link to the last part. In many ways, I think we have gone through shocks due to the pandemic, but now we have another shock of an enormous proportion that may force us to address much more swiftly dependency on energy, for example, from one source, which clearly may not necessarily be there. And it might then imply that we are going through, from the EU point of view, the twin transitions actually faster than earlier envisaged. I saw a question on the chat in terms of emissions, etc. One can look at it in many ways. One way would be that we will go through this faster than we earlier would have thought. So I think I leave it at that for this round. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Annika, for weighing in on your way ahead. And you actually bridged very nicely towards what I want to talk about. I want to squeeze in a very quick question for the panel, along with any final remarks that you may have. And the question is the following. If we step back and ponder what are all the ways in which this is a game changer, and when I say game changer, I mean with respect to what Europe is, for what it stands for, and how it asserts itself in the global arena, how it can reshape its approach from security to energy security, raw material sourcing, international supply chains, and everything and anything in between. What are all the channels through which this can make Europe the stronger, the more potent version of itself that it has desired and it has expressed as a part of this strategic autonomy and strategic sovereignty push in the past? How can it seize the day? How can it seize this as an opportunity? Whoever wants to start, the floor is yours.
Maybe I may start, and also because I have a small comment on something Annika said before, which I think is very interesting and reminded me that I missed at one point in design, showing the implication of this crisis for the euro area economy. The impact will not be uniform at all. She mentioned the fact that the impact will differ among countries. And that will be because of the trade links with Russia differ, because the energy reliance is different, so many factors. And second, also within economies, the sector by industry will differ, because some industries are energy intensive or use a lot of natural gas for their production process. They will be hit. They're already being hit. Some firms have stopped producing at present because of the increasing cost. And we should not forget that the impact is not uniform globally. This is a very idiosyncratic shock on Europe. And these companies will lose some competitive edge versus their competitors in Asia or in the US. So I think this lack of uniformity will be crucial also in assessing the impact in the future. That said, coming to your final question, I do think that this is going to be a game changer also regarding the attitude of EU governments on fronts disregarded until a few years ago. It seems to me that many governments have now realized that after this second war in Ukraine, what they didn't understand after the first war, leading to connected to the annexation of Crimea. Just read the statements made by the German Prime Minister Olaf Scholz to the Bundestag on Sunday. You see clearly there that now they think that Putin's Russia has an imperialistic agenda, something they did not believe before. Before, the attitude in Italy, in Germany, was Putin's Russia is a sort of kleptocracy. They are just interested in earning money and getting rich. That's it. That's the way we should deal with Russia. It's not the case. Now there is an understanding in Germany and in Italy that the situation is different. What kind of change this will bring? First of all, we have already seen an increase in interest on spending for defense. So the target of 2% to GDP for defense spending is now becoming more accepted. It was disregarded until yesterday. Energy strategy, because it was mentioned over and over. Now we need to think what kind of energy strategy we need for the future. We have a long-term goal. In the previous strategy, natural gas was playing a very significant role. Now what? Should we invest more quickly on renewables, or should we do something else? This is something that has to be decided. Final remark: all this will come with a cost. I mean, we are now in an uncooperative outcome of this game between Russia and the EU. This uncooperative outcome involves a suboptimal payoff for both. The best position would have been to see a Russian government focusing on long-term and social development. That would have allowed a much better outcome for all of us: more trade, more growth, more welfare for everyone. Unfortunately, Putin has chosen another path. So this way, I think we will pay a price, and the price will be more wasteful spending, because defense spending is not good for welfare in general. The alternatives also, in terms of energy strategy, could be more costly, less efficient than others. So I think we shall pay a price, but I think there is an alternative, and we have to move along that path.
Thank you, Luca. And straight to you, Vladimir. What is your take? How is this a game changer for Europe and in general for geopolitics?
Well, I think this is a moment of a painful realization that some of the previous strategies of pacification of dictatorships through commerce obviously didn't work. Because there was this big expectation. It concerns not only Russia, but also other authoritarian dictatorships like China. If we increase trade, if we introduce commerce, investments, that would act as a mitigating factor, which was reduce tensions and lead us to some, whatever model of future peaceful and normal relationships that can exist. I heard this from many European politicians and experts and businessmen in the past few years, like we traded gas with the Soviet Union despite American reluctance, and that had somehow contributed to the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the Helsinki Accords, whatever. I think this is a moment of painful realization that economic dependence on dictatorships might be disrupted. And I believe that not without some discussion on the matter, also discussion about costs, as Luca has just mentioned. Costs are important. They will be painful somehow, and some people will be unhappy about that. But after some of the discussion, I believe that this moment would serve as a trigger, as you're saying, as a game changer, to actually shift the policies towards dramatic lessening of various forms of economic dependence on potentially dangerous authoritarian nations. We're not talking only about Russia. That's a long topic. I don't want to engage in broad conversation about this, but I think the action will be done. I think what we are seeing right now will serve as a policy trigger for decades to come, as a point of reference for building policy. And particularly in the energy field, there will be some temporary debates about revival of coal and nuclear, but ultimately this will spark the acceleration of green transition, which will only be for the better. And also, let me say that there's a painful topic we've been touching here about reconstruction of Ukraine, which inevitably largest part of the bill will have to be paid by future Russia, which is extremely unfortunate for me to even think of. I can't even imagine the costs. But future normal democratic Russia will also benefit from the green transition, because we'll have a huge market opening where we can also participate and benefit from it, create a lot of jobs, create a lot of income, and finally break away with this fossil fuel economy, which is also fueling the authoritarianism and imperialism with huge oil and gas rents.
Thank you very much to all the speakers for their thoughts. We have a couple of minutes left, so I'd like to very quickly open the floor for questions. So for our registered participants, if you can raise your hand, our production will let you in and you can ask the question on the live stream. Do I see any questions?
If not, maybe I can just use that moment to think about a question, just to reinforce the point that I do think this is a game changer. I agree. I think that has opened up the eyes of many EU countries, and we have a much more similar view now on our relations with Russia. This unification has also seen not only within the EU, but also with G7. And I think the sanctions would not have been possible without this. It is, in that respect, clearly a game changer. But I want to reiterate a point or make a point, and that is many of the challenges that we are facing today are truly global in nature. And it is very important how we now go about making clear on what and how to push sanctions on Russia and isolate Russia without necessarily isolating all the other emerging economies at the same time, because we will not be successful in addressing climate change if we don't have the largest emitters with us. So in that respect, I think it's really important that we also keep the discussion channels open, and that just like the pandemic, the COVID pandemic was an enabler to go forward more quickly with the digital transition, I think this will be an enabler to go much more forward quickly on the greening of the economies. There I very much share Vladimir's view that painful it will be, costly it will be, we will have much more investments going forward, but we might find ourselves going much more quickly towards the greening that we have thought of. And we are now, in order just to reduce dependency and ensure security and stability, economic and politically and socially, this will actually speed up the twin transitions that we are aiming for. Thanks.
Thank you, Annika. Actually, we have one question from an anonymous attendee asking about this. The question goes, do you see any chance to change the net zero emission target by 2050 in order to counterbalance the potential energy embargo?
Well, maybe I take that one, and it's just to say that if anything, we are not going to push it out further. This is not going to delay the Green Deal. So if anything, it's going to advance it. I think how it's going to be done still remains to be seen. And just as said, it is a global challenge. And I think we do want to do this in a way where we have our global partners with us, and the impact is different. And the costs are different. And there are very many aspects to this. So it's not an easy one, but we would need to work on this. And I think we will be forced to, just in order to reduce our dependency. We have no choice. So in that respect, if anything, it would speed it up.
Thank you very much. We have heard this loud and clear. If anyone wants to add something, please. If not, then I would like to thank very much to our panelists, our speakers, Mr. Luka Mesomo, Mr. Vladimir Milov, and Ms. Annika Eriksgaard for this fruitful and interesting discussion today on economic and social repercussion of the Ukraine crisis. And please stay tuned for other coverage of the Ukraine situation by Globsec. Thank you very much and have a great day.